And if Google is to be believed, we are now live, broadcasting around the world, from around the world. We've got Ron Edwards in the part of the world that I consider to be the normal part of the world, and me over here in Korea. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be sharing the screen with you after all those wonderful videos.
Well, it must have been a little weird for you to see the book gone through that way.
It was the kind of thing that I think I, as in author mode, can only dream of when you're actually writing it, because you're kind of thinking of somebody doing that eventually, and all your buddies are no help at all because they elect themselves co-author if you give them anything to read, so that ruins it. So, bless them and all. But, an actual cold read from someone who acquired it all by himself, for reasons that have nothing to do with knowing you, liking you, or anything,
Right.
Completely, it's impossible before you're done with it. And so it's, to me, was incredibly welcome. I mean, you could have said tons of things, far, far, far more, how am I going to put it? You could have had a very negative reading of it, and I still would have said, oh boy.
Right. Well, that's good. I'm glad it wasn't too too bizarre. So what are we talking about? We're talking about, let's see if I can actually get it in the shot, Circle of Hands, the recently, I'm going to say recently released, Iron Age fantasy RPG by Ron Edwards, released by Adept Press. Could you give us a little bit of history into the release cycle for this version of the game?
Well, for one thing, was it's dredging up from 20 years of sitting in the humblest possible circumstances of a laser printout from the early 90s, in the crappy manila folder, in the back of your gaming stuff, where literally it did sit for, almost 20 years. And so the release cycle kind of begins with that, but there's a fair amount of text about that in the book. In this case, I think it really centers on the Kickstarter process. The fact is, and I don't think I've ever really heard anybody say this, which is surprising, I don't think it's that profound, you don't need to have a huge fund in order to print a role-playing game these days. Print-on-demand services are excellent. There are quite a few different ones, either the shared ones that many people know about and use online, or single companies. There are literally hundreds of them around the world. And if you wanted to set up your PDF for suitable for print, and then you set up an account with these people, and it doesn't count, it doesn't cost a thing. If anybody wants a book, they order it and they get it. You don't have to make print runs anymore. If you need a small fund of books of your own, you print them at cost, get them sent to you. It's the easiest thing in the world. So the idea that you need this massive, massive fund to publish a role-playing game is, and even as a book, is flatly false. The quality of these books is as good as you're going to get anywhere. And so what do you need a Kickstarter for? And in many cases, I think there are two reasons, one of which I find kind of nauseating, but it is a reason, and the other one I think is an excellent reason. I've done 2 successful Kickstarters out of 3 so far, and I've used it for both of these reasons myself, holding my nose for the first. The first is the promotion. For a fair amount of time, I don't know if it's reached its peak. It may have reached its peak in terms of enthusiasm. I don't know, possibly so. But for a fair amount of time now, crowdfunding and particularly Kickstarter have been the primary means of promotion. It's not simply a way to get your project funded. It's a way to get your projects noticed and talked about and reshared and all manner of other things. And I say that's kind of a nauseating reason because it turns the process, it turns Kickstarter and sites like it into a Robux, Sears and Robux catalog, where you're basically just pre-ordering. I mean, that's all there is to it. And that
With
is
all the pains that come along with that.
well, many pains, and in particular, it adds a deadline. I mean, that was the joy of 2005 on, is that you no longer needed a deadline to do a role-playing game. Who cares about Origins or Gen Con? The internet is the internet. And so, and if you put it out, 8 months before Gen Con, people are just as happy to get it there as they were before. So the idea was that the deadline was no longer an excuse or a reason for dropping in quality or playtesting or anything like that. Well, now we have Kickstarter deadlines back again, and here we are landed with, the curse, and people jumping into it without knowing a thing about what it takes from completion of a manuscript to the packaging of a printable object is really a terrible thing. A great deal of the Kickstarter projects that I've got have been subpar in their final stage of production features, and that's just tragic. I mean, these are dreams people are making. Yeah. So that's what's kind of nauseating about it. It's added an uncritical enthusiasm that I'm not really sure is worth the genuine or marketing or practical enthusiasm. So that's the one reason. The other one, bluntly, is that art costs a lot. If you really want to push for it, I feel kind of bad at all the all the amazing talent we see in fantasy and horror and other genre illustration out there. I've always thought that was the big weak link in role-playing, was the ability to recompense artists. And as you know, the history of role-playing is rife with unpaid artists and artists who feel loyalty to a line, so they bust out work that would be, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars per piece if it were in any other line of employment. That's just one place where the commerce level has never reached, I think, its necessary sustenance point. I'm actually happier sometimes to see more break-in or amateurish art if it has a lot of energy, simply because I don't feel bad about somebody turning in these phenomenal oil paintings and getting paid a bucket of chicken wings for it. Right. So anyway, being able to kickstart or crowdfund to pay for art and other aspects of production. I mean, clearly, I'm just a piker in this regard. Look at Jim Raji, right, in Finland. I mean, and look at what he's doing with that, and he's just light years ahead of me as far as organizing that kind of thing. So crowdfunding is great for that. So really, the Circle of Hands, I don't know if I'm really answering your question. I'm trying. Circle of Hands has its origin as in the object you're holding has an enormous amount to do with the Kickstarter process, and especially because I put that playtest document up there for public scrutiny and playtesting. Yes. Made such a huge difference. I got more cold playtesting out of this than I think I have for any of my other games. Maybe not in quantity, but in terms of width, or breadth of experience with it. That really informs me about what I would or wouldn't say in the text, especially because I offered and made good on saying, look, if you say something that hits me between the eyes, it's going in the book with your credit. And I think that created a conversational tone throughout. The book in some ways is written in this incredibly cold clinical style. I mean, I talk about what a knife can do to a human body and stuff like that, and to put in the warmth of contact with people who've touched the manuscript along the way, it created a really nice feeling to me. It was like feeling the hot and the cold water be warm. At least that's my sensation when I read it now.
But it's in there. I mean, when we were talking about the art a moment ago, when you open it up, I was very pleased to see a long list of not only the artists, but their contact information.
I always do that. Every book. Yeah, it drives me nuts. Here, I'm a publisher. Here I am looking at it, and it's not like the artists help very much on their own websites. They're notoriously lacking in contact information. I don't know why. And I've for years and years and years, I've been gnashing my teeth at saying, how do I get in touch with this person? Right. So yeah,
so that was
I appreciate
nice.
You noticed that.
And the feedback throughout by name you know, this comment comes in from, you know, playtester so and so, like Ken, for example, and this is what they had to say. I found that really helpful in contextualizing what I was reading the first time.
I appreciate that, because it goes to something that we were thinking of talking about soon, which is the rundown.
The rundown.
But my thinking has a lot to do with the experience of contacting a game. I wrote Circle of Hands much more as a reader. I'm thinking as a reader rather than some other roles that I might have while writing, and certainly not as a performer. Somebody performing for the reader's entertainment. I was thinking more in terms of how does a reader contact these things, and I was thinking, well, you know, they contact it as somebody grappling with the rules, or with the text itself. Why not put them right in touch with those people who have been doing this for months? It was nice. There were people who did playtesting that had not, you know, that I didn't know very well, for example, who didn't, you know, who had their own priorities or had no idea about the game except what they'd seen at the Kickstarter page. And some of them really turned in some great work. I had some rules about the playtesting, which I think I may have mentioned. I've learned, as I alluded to a little while ago, boundaries when you're developing a game are huge. And it was one of the biggest problems in the independent scene from 10 years ago. People would elect themselves co-authors, and it was very easy to overwhelm the author with, you should do this or you need to do that. And so I disallowed all suggestions. I said, I just wanted you to answer and just tell me about what it was like to play. Tell me how you interacted with the instructions. Tell me how it worked out. Tell me when it seemed like it was not fun. Tell me when you thought it was confusing. Anything like that. But don't tell me anything. Don't say, oh, this needs to be like that. I just wanted to process all of that, throw it into the hopper of my judgments about those things. And the more I think about it, the more I wish that had been an explicit feature back in the Forge processes of reading one another's games. I just don't think a reader ever knows where a writer is in the process of nailing stuff down. Something could be nailed down from the second you stuck it on that page, or you could have put it on that page merely to hold space while you thought about it some more.
Right.
And if somebody gives you very, very long instructions about how you should write that thing, and you're saying, well, that thing just went out the window the second I heard how it went for you in play, you know, look, this is not... And then you have to explain it to them. Yeah, exactly. Then you have to explain it to them. They're going to demand explanations, and finally you say, all right, you know, shut up. So that rule really went a long way, and I think made the productions more. What did I say? The productions made the conversations more productive.
Right. So let's talk about the rundown. At what point did, let's say, the rundown enter your interaction with playtests or
well,
others?
That's kind of interesting. That's an interesting way of putting it. First of all, do you want to tell what the rundown is from the perspective of somebody picking up the book?
So when you get Circle of Hands, one of the very first things that you will encounter is a 2.5-page section called The Absolute Rundown. And it's point by point everything that this game, I guess, is. Just barring system, right?
Well, there's a little bit of system in there too. Tells you like what dice you roll and stuff like that, and a couple of the things that that enter into those mechanics. But effectively, it's a bullet point, you know, data dump of everything that I can think of when I'm reading a role-playing game. I have long understood that when I want to learn a game, I become very unreasonable. I don't want to hear a thing unless I know already how it relates to all the other things, which I haven't read yet.
Right.
and that's exactly, I mean, you can't explain a role-playing game to a person. They start hammering you with questions instantly about how you say, well, there are these two different races, and then instantly they say something like, well, are they different in mechanics? Well, I haven't talked about mechanics yet. Hold on, man, two races, I haven't even named them yet. And have you ever read, I'm sure you have, that hilarious account of role players trying to play baseball?
No, actually.
No, I don't have the link handy or anything, but to run a Google and you'll see it. It's
Right.
hysterical. They instantly begin arguing about the rules, not because they want the game to play differently, because they're asking why. How come there aren't 5 bases? Well, you see, there's 3 bases. How come there aren't 5? Bam, just like that. And I mean, it absolutely captures us as a subculture. And and so I was thinking about that, and I was saying, well, you know what? I'm going to say I'm not going to explain anything in this rundown, but I am going to give you everything, so that just sentence by sentence by sentence by sentence, you could conceivably you could read it in any order. You're just going to get all the different parts that are there, and in a way, as I put it, the rest of the book is footnotes to this rundown. That way, at least you see all the points up there on the whiteboard at once, without me trying to explain it in detail. That's another thing. You know your old D&D books quite well. You know how interesting it is to try and be reading about the different characteristics, then all of a sudden, in the middle of the dexterity section, they're explaining the initiative rules. That was 1978. I'm 1979. I'm reading this, right? And I'm going, wait a minute. And that's an example. Our brains fire real fast about, well, what's it for? What does it do? How does it work with that? So I was trying to compensate for that. I can understand I understand it entirely. And I wanted to alleviate some of that, especially because the book is stealthy. I don't say it using those words, but the book is stealthy. It looks like a fantasy role-playing game. It looks like, I make my character, he's got his sword, and he does this to hit with the sword, and, and there's magic. Okay, how do I do magic? I mean, you're in pretty familiar territory. Hey, you guys are all getting on horses, and you're riding somewhere. There's something dangerous there. Well, we know that too, right? I mean, it seems very, very right there, just the way it should be. And depending, I might want to interview you about this, you kind of sort of discover that I'm up to something instead, or if that's the right way to put it, or that the game fires on other cylinders than that sometimes, or on more than that. And so I kind of wanted to get as much of that up front without promising, just saying, and also so that when people ran into certain things later and are baffled, utterly baffled, what do you mean the wizards have every spell? That is something that I wanted said somewhere way up front.
Way up front, yeah.
All the weird things as well as the ordinary things, they're all in the rundown.
Right. So the rundown's on page 10, and it spills over onto the first half of page 12, and it's bullet points like the most common technological materials are wood, wrought iron, and leather. Simple question, or you play characters who've banded together to support the young king and Rolke, who opposes both kinds of magic, black and white. And you're not only a trained fighter, no matter what your social background and prior life, but you use both kinds of magic at once. This group is called the Circle. It's the only one. That line right there can be ridiculous.
I appreciate that. I mean, for me, these are the things that I want to know. And as you know, people grapple with this all the time. This is one of my first heavy setting books. I've done lots of setting in role-playing games. A lot of people think they don't associate the word setting with me, but if you really look across my library of books, you're going to find some pretty radical settings, and some of them in rather shocking detail. And so this one is the first one that actually says so. Instead of just the setting hopping in there, kind of when you're not looking, this is the first one that basically says, here's the map. And the other interesting thing about that for me is that it's, I think I wanted there to be an instruments of play available. The rundown is also available as its own PDF. And I even say it, look, I want you to print that out. I want you to print that out. I want you to give it to everybody when you sit down. Don't try and pitch the game. Just let this do it. Just let them take a look. You know, this is what they want to see. When you pitch a game, this is what people want. And they want to know it all at once. So there it is. It's all at once.
All at once.
There you go. You know, so having that be an instrument of play as well as just part of the book is my goal, you know, as well. I think that's kind of what I have to say about it, unless you have another specific question.
We started a conversation, you know, other readers of the book and I, as we were starting to go through, started a conversation about the rundown, and the basic response was, why does it disappear in more games? Like once you see it, it's like, this is that element that's been missing. It's not back of the book text, right? It's not the kind of thing you want to see on the back of the book. You want someone to get you all hyperbolic and excited about the game on the back. But when you open it up, it's like, what am I going to be reading? And the table of contents doesn't do it. The index doesn't really do it. No. Flip through doesn't do it. Chapter titles don't do it. The organization will be opaque to you until you start reading it. But this 2.5 pages was, I thought, a really clever way to go about.
I find that very gratifying, of course, and thank you. It also brings up the fact that processing a potentially played role-playing game, something that somebody at your table, maybe even somebody who has some social authority about these decisions, wants you to play, it's a very complex cognitive act, isn't it, over the next few minutes?
Right.
Because you're thinking about how is this game going to go? And there's lots of questions one has in mind. Where's the fun? Where's the part? I mean, it's a very valid question. How come we're not playing the game we always play or played last time? Right. How come? Why not? I mean, that's a very good question. And the idea that the game system has its own qualities, well, there are game systems whose qualities are very difficult for me to want to forgive. Or more accurately for myself to do. I know if this game does that, oh well, you know what? I'd rather maybe we should just watch a movie. You know, let's put in an old episode of, you know, Blake 7 or something. You know, we can do that. And so the idea that what are you processing when we put together all these pieces of a pitched game? We're processing how are we going to interact. What are the moving pieces of the system? What are the things, and more important, or even more importantly, what's the color of it all? What am I going to be imagining? What's it going to look like? You know, what about the tone of it all? You know, and the trouble is, these questions are almost impossible to answer simultaneously. If you're talking about the wood and the wrought iron and the leather, and you're talking about the way characters improve or don't improve, or how easy it is for them to die mechanically. All of those, I mean, it's rather impressive how many cognitive directions are firing at once in those conversations.
Exponentially larger for each person at the table.
Sure, and how many differences of, I mean, how many habits or expectations are people bringing? I mean, just to give you an old example, damage in Sorcerer is, like some other games, has an instantaneous level as well as a thereafter level. You know, in other words, how much of the damage sticks, right? How much of the damage of the moment sticks is a thing in Sorcerer. And I saw in early play of the game, people would take an X amount, and that seems to them bigger than the score that they associated with their character's hardiness. And without a microsecond where I could stop them, crumpled up their character sheet, threw it petulantly on the table, and folded their arms and glared at me.
He's dead.
You're kind of like, that's not mechanically the way death works in the game. But do you see what I mean by an expectation that nobody
Yeah.
ever would have thought to correct ahead of time? You were sort of expecting that when we got to this point that, you'd learn the mechanics for it when we got to this point. But no, you had it already taped in your head how characters die. And had assigned the pieces of the game into that process. So everybody at the table has that going on too. And it's not, I really didn't want that happening with Circle of Hands. There were so many ways it could instantly either slide directly into Warhammer. It's a very good candidate for where a superficial contact with this game could slide, which is great. I'm not saying it's a bad game. I'm saying it's not this game.
Right.
And then the same thing goes for Dogs in the Vineyard by Vincent Baker, which is also about a bunch of grim individuals riding horses with dangerous weapons going off to deal with some local hassle. Right. And superficially, they have a great deal in. Superficially, they look alike. Well, the quickness with which people would start playing dogs with Circle is high. Is real. The quickness of sliding there. So that's another reason that the whole rundown became a priority.
Right, and it's right there, right up front.
Mm-hmm.
I got to bring up the map that you mentioned, and because it's got some interesting qualities that I think will benefit this particular conversation. So everyone should be able to see that now, I think. There we go.
By Tony Dowling.
Yeah. So one of the first things I noted when I looked at it was that there are no names on this map.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, with the proviso that if there had been names, there would only have been the 4 regions, Rolka,
right.
Tamarion, Famberga, and Spur. And those would have been it. And they just would have been kind of shadowy superimposed over regions. But given the relief and the grayscale of the map, if you put shadowy superimpositions over it, it would have screwed it all up. It would have looked terrible. And you wouldn't have been able to read, you wouldn't be able to see the map very well. So I just want to specify that it's not as though my plan was to have no names on the map, but if there were, it only would have been those 4, and I was just as happy not to have them once I saw how nice the map looked in its detail. The fact is that people in the Crescent Land have no concept or use of maps the way you and I do.
Right.
And they don't. The map to them is an instrument to get from a place to a place. They don't need, want, or even think of the bird's eye view of the geography.
Right.
And as I pointed out, a map in the sense that we would use only the more specialized scholars of the land would have anyway. I would imagine schematic maps would be, and especially local ones, say people who are thinking of putting together all the different war bands in this particular region to do a thing, they would be interested in a schematic map. But it would be for their use. It wouldn't be published as a map for other people to, it's not a piece of literature. It's not a piece of scholarship. It's an instrument for their immediate ends. Right. And so those maps wouldn't be preserved in any particular way. Once you use it to explain to the other local chieftains what you're up to, well, shit, toss in the fire. We're done with that. Or scrape that crap off the vellum, and give it back to the scribes. They needed to write some other damn thing down. So, so the map concept for me, I wanted to. I was talking only to the reader because the reader needs that geography. The reader needs that cartographic understanding of the whole setting, but it's an outsider's view to look at the map in the first place.
Right.
And in that case, since there aren't any boundaries in the culture, just like, frankly, until people started making maps in the way that I'm talking about, there really aren't any boundaries. And if you culturally, you're not there. If you've ever, I find it fascinating to be in the areas that I think of as borderlands in Europe and or in the States too, and discover that the borders and the on the map, the state borders are not the same as the borders, and the borders themselves are not lines, they're bands. Or even whole regions, like a whole valley or something. And
on the other side of that river is their land.
well, yeah, except that's not the way it works, because people live up and down the river.
Right.
And so really what you have is a hybrid zone that people don't really care about in terms of who they are. They only care about it once the taxmen come or war begins or something like that. But it's not really, a lot of these areas that I'm talking about are kind of out of the range of taxation for most of the world's history. So it's so anyway, what I'm getting at is that there aren't any state borders in the Crescent Land.
Right.
And therefore, and names, I didn't talk about this much in the text, but names change. The name of a given town is, it's called that, but it warps faster than I think people realize historically. So I really just wanted the reader to see this map and get the geography, and perhaps even be catapulted into a questioning state, if at all possible.
Well, that's exactly what happened when I saw it. 'Cause my first question is, okay, well, where are these 4 regions? And then as the text describes them as you would, I feel, describe an area to your friend.
Mm-hmm.
Rolke's like this and Femberga's like that. And so when you actually enter into play, you can repurpose that information and just use it rather than having to start cold and concoct it. And so I thought that was
one thing
helpful.
too that I learned from I don't know if you're familiar with my game Trollbabe, which has a similar looking map across a much bigger geographic range, and that one has a few place names, usually kind of provocative place names, set in different places around the map and nothing else. And unlike Circle of Hands, there is no canonical setting. You only discover the setting geographically in Trollbabe by playing the game. Every time there is an adventure, it occurs at a given place in the map, and then and only then is it created what's actually there.
Right.
And this actually goes back to my other work in my supplement Sorcerer and Sword, where I talk about how authors built fantasy settings through writing the stories about locations in them, and only later did they, get a map. And This is the case for Howard. It's the case, I know everybody's going to yell at me for that, but it's kind of the case for Tolkien too. And it's the case for Moorcock. It's the case for many of the classic fantasy writers. The early stories, they just didn't have that map.
Right.
And Sorcerer and Sword does that. Trollbabe does it a different way. And then Circle of Hands is interesting because it does have a more concrete setting, but I don't specify what's in that particular location. I say, okay, here's this large community, but I'm not telling you what it's like. You will have to do some of the creative legwork. Your Crescent Land is not my Crescent Land. Your circle, there's only one circle, so when you play, your setting is no longer compatible with mine, by definition. So in a way, it's a canonical setting, but it must and absolutely must be adopted at your table. And I think the map is built to help with that.
I think so. Both liberating and maybe for some terrifying to have that much trust given to them right at the outset. So it's kind of like this. Cool.
I've heard that before. That observation has been made.
Let's take a step to the side. When you run Circle of Hands, what has actually come up?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. I often post about this at my forum, which is minimally attended, and so it doesn't really get out that much. Let's see. Let me kick back to some of the games. I've been so involved in Dr. Chaos for the last 6 months that I have to blink a couple of times. But one of the things that cropped up first, and you can probably tell by the energy that I've put into it in the text itself, one of the reasons that I love Manticores, as I say in the text, is not because, it goes all the way back to mythology and also to Glorantha and stuff like that. I've always loved Manticores, but in the case of Circle of Hands, there was a particularly chilling adventure that was played. This was in Sweden, and I was vacationing in Sweden with my wife and children, and a number of people knew I was coming, and actually drove across, tons of miles, which is unusual for Europeans, to come play with me, and we did a play test, and the idea that you had a older chieftain, his somewhat, shall we say, less forceful son, who was being self-pressuring into doing all kinds of reckless and cruel things just because he wanted to be, respected. And then you had this Manticore, and nobody knew what it was yet. They just knew that people were wandering off, sometimes talking about their loved ones or something, about their lost child or something like that. And the way it worked out was they had no idea what they were up against when they tracked it down. And to describe a Manticore in terms of people who had never seen one, trying to describe it as the impressions that they were getting as it lunged at them, really had a charge for me. And this game also was special because it was one of these games where people made up slightly superficial characters to start, and then they snapped into place really fast. And one of the characters was this spooky, witchy, standoffish woman, and one of the other characters was an extremely stereotyped, all yang guy, the biggest frat boy warrior you ever saw. And about halfway through the game, we all blinked and looked at each other, and one of the players said, "Those two are in love with each other."
Boom.
Yeah. And, we all kind of looked at each other, and he was right. The way they'd been played, and nobody had really thought about it, but the organics of play had turned them into characters who would never, ever, ever tell, or each other, or even themselves, but they were truly and deeply in love. And it was, that was that playtest that made me say, something is good here at the table with this game, something that I need to make the rules a garden for. I need to make the rules a place where this kind of stuff can grow when people find it, when they realize what they're doing. And so other things that have come up, I've been very careful in the last, for a long time, I'm very careful about using the randomized method for prep, and I'm sticking close to it every single time, and not cheating. I mean, I don't know how many times I've told you I've dreamed, I'm like rolling the dice and saying, "Oh, I so want this kind of creature, in this region, please come up, But I'm honest, and I say, no, I'm going to follow the way. One moment, please. Guess what? First interruption, right?
It happens.
Hello, I'm talking to South Korea right now. Can we keep it quick? Hello. See ya. Bye. You are...
We're talking to South Korea. I don't want to talk to you.
All of it. Yeah, exactly. Sorry. Yeah. But the deal here is that you... so I take what I get, and there was an instance where there was a playtesting scenario in which it was all white magic, and I had a unicorn. I had there were two elements of white magic, and so I had a unicorn and a wizard, and which is a whole lot of firepower in one spot.
Yeah.
And I even had I believe some kind of big humanitarian crisis going on. So it was really a circumstance in which I got to see just how people reacted to the stereotypically good magic. And of course they reacted as I hoped anyway. It was successful in that they hated it. And I have found in practice that every single time I've brought in the Amborion magic, that the characters have a visceral loathing for it that is very gratifying. I'll tell you, I find the demonic and black magic and the undead stuff endearing. I love it. I mean, you're like, oh, you guys are so sick. You know, I can't wait. This is a great. And then on the other hand, I put in a unicorn or something like that, and I'm like, kill it with fire, kill it. You know, no, this must stop. And so and it's a pleasure to see that come in. That's something that has cropped up a lot in play. I have often found that the more I make the soap opera complicated, the more trouble I run into at the table. And so that's one reason you may have noticed that I am maybe surprisingly, I say there always has to be soap opera. It's a given among the NPCs, but don't overcomplicate it. Don't make every last person tangled up with the problems of every last other person. Don't make the knot too tight of what's there. And that was, and I discovered that when I played a game which had two brothers and a dead father, and each brother thought the other had killed him. And then there was some knowledge that they had to look for there, and I remember playing that game, and it was too much like guess what the GM is thinking. What is the GM up to with these characters? And I think that I want the energy of social conflict going on in each spot so that the NPCs are extremely reactive, hyper-reactive, in fact. But I really don't want the players to be sitting there and saying, oh my God, we can't make a move until we know what's going on.
Right.
You know, and I think that's those are some of the experiences that I ran into that tuned or sanded off or made me realize that, for example, a sector of rules was not appropriate for this game after all. I'm trying to think of some of the other dramatic moments of play, but I'll say that drawing up a volcano in the streets of Spur was a gratifying moment for a player. You know, you don't have your armor. You know, there's three guys with crossbows, and it's a stone city, the biggest, most elaborate city in the whole Crescent Land. They've got carts to kneel behind, and you're just going, you know, these guys are going to just skewer me with crossbow bolts. I am going to be a human pincushion in a second. And you're like, bam, volcano, here. You know, kaboom! Property damage? Yeah, property damage. Fuck you. And your crossbows. You know? And so it's, I think, if you're looking at those 3-point spells and you think, man, this is a little too much, look at this. That's what I want. Those are too much. You bet they are.
Yeah, that brings us right to the killing chapter, actually, not the combat chapter as we noted before, but the killing chapter. Some of these things are, I think you did it intentionally to add that point of decision, not what am I going to do, but you know, that moment, like, I'm just killing this guy because I've decided to do that, or I'm going to cause a volcano to erupt in downtown.
There's a productive balance, I think, between the shall we say the pretend excitement of violence and death and killing people. You know, that it taken its purest form would be a first-person shooter, I suppose. And there's a balance between that and, for lack of a better word, the genuine horror at one person ending the life of another. And as soon as we get a little real about that, most people, you know, suddenly get a twinge, and I include people who've killed others in military service or in other circumstances, or people who've killed a lot of animals in the course of their work or anything like that. There's a recognition that what you're doing here is a significant act. And as I say, there's a productive balance. How do you arrive at something which stands on the line between the two of those, is something I was aiming at. And to do that in a role-playing game is edgy, right? I mean, fun death turns out to be kind of the default, and
Yeah.
I wanted to say, if you're going to call your fantasy a gritty fantasy, if you're going to say I'm going to do Dark Ages, since that seems to be all the rage, then don't give me fun death. Don't give me just first-person shooter death.
Right. The chrome armor and
yeah. So let's try and really that too. How are we going to do this actually? How are we going to make this carry some weight? And I think that and again, it's a decision point. You've run, I venture to say, more than 2 role-playing sessions in your time as a GM.
More than 2.
Exactly. And I'm interested to know, in your judgment of yourself, so if you were a third-person observer, would you say that guy always knows when the big fight is going to happen and with whom during his role-playing sessions?
There was a period where I was that guy.
Mm-hmm.
But now I'm trying to just let things happen.
Right. And I think that has been the journey of a lot of us. And so, in a way, games that are written to be perfect for that GM. And interestingly enough, I would venture to say that the Fate family of games is an attempt to make that way of playing as easy and as,
sure,
how lubricated as possible.
How can you tell your story?
Well, yes, but then that's one way to do it. How do you tell your story and let other people, put in harmonica notes to that line of melody? That is one ideal of play, but I don't happen to share it, at least not in the games that I design. I prefer that I am, as I've said in several publications, I prefer that I'm holding down the bass line as the GM. And the content of the melody, what it sounds like, how many are contributing to the melody or counterpoints or whatever, is much more their problem and not mine, as long as I am hitting. I mean, if you're into rock and roll, when you hit 4 in the 1, 2, 3, 4 count, that's the magic bass moment. And as long as I'm nailing the 4 on the 4 count every time, then if I need to trust that someone else is good at and energized to, take over that solo. And I think that analogy has served me very well over the years, and that's when. And you might wonder, why am I babbling about music and all this? I'm talking about when you kill in a role-playing game.
Right.
In a fantasy role-playing game set in an Iron Age setting, when does one kill? And it really is interesting to me. I have not actually seen an episode of Game of Thrones. And didn't even know it had become a thing, really. Believe it or not, I just hadn't. And I watched Vikings well into the process of Circle of Hands, rather than beforehand. And I had read long ago the Game of Thrones books, or a number of them. And I'll tell you what, those books didn't enter into the way that those books handle when conflicts arise and what fights are about. Just didn't. I don't know about the TV show, but what the books, just of all the many, many, many things I've read, isolating Game of Thrones in my mind, that's not the logic that I'm using when I play or for Circle of Hands. It's more like when I watched Vikings, I was kind of like, what, is this guy looking at my rule book? These guys are fighting. They don't want to just run off. And there's a couple of bonkers ones who don't mind just killing once in a while, but everybody else thinks they're bonkers. Everybody else is kind of like, no, fighting hurts. I'm
going to be laid up for ages unless I do this just right.
Yeah, I got to do it. And you know what? It's like when the father instructs his son. He's like, look, there's no such thing as a fair fight. And which is actually a quote from my book. I don't know if he said it outright in the show, but because I've been, that's been a thing of mine for years. But the idea is that you say, how is it that anybody would fight without having the drop on the other guy?
Right.
There's the number of the whole we stand each other down in the street and then we say draw. That doesn't happen. The way people were killed in those circumstances, somebody walked up behind the other guy and blew his head off, and he wasn't looking. That's how you kill a guy with a 6-gun. And
Yeah,
so,
look this way.
yeah, exactly. And so I think that with Circle of Hands, that's what I'm aiming at, is the visceral ick, the moral ambiguity of killing, and the responsibility of doing so. And yet also it is a violent fantasy, so there's a little catharsis in there too. So I'm already walking kind of a squeaky moral experiential line there. And then finally the idea of, no, the GM's not going to decide, man. He's just not. He doesn't know. There's only one way we know. Either what you did prompted him to say, God, that NPC is going to kill his ass now. and he didn't know that NPC was going to do that in the beginning of the
I
day.
thought.
Yeah. And so, and then you, conversely, and usually more likely, sooner or later, a player character, looks at another player. A player looks at another player and says, "My guy's going to kill that guy's ass." Get my. I don't know if have you played it yet, by the way?
I haven't had a chance to play it. I've got several people who have wanted to find a schedule though.
When you can, but one thing I hope you experience, and I've seen it from a number of other people, is when players look at each other and then one of them turns to you and says, "We're putting on our armor." And then it's guaranteed the next scene, if you don't describe it, they will. There's going to be a power walk.
Right.
When they go somewhere now, they're doing the power walk.
They can see the slow motion in their heads.
They might even be miming it at the table. They might even be doing the exactly. So and I think that's what I'm aiming at with why the chapter is called Killing, and the exactly what you point out. It's this decision point that's exciting, and it's a profound issue of philosophies of play among many variables, but certainly one of them is there a final set piece toward which we all know, and frankly are a little relieved to know, that we're aiming toward? That's one way to play. Is there a big bad? Is there a, let me give you an example. Many years ago, I was playing in another fellow's game of Star Wars D20. And I, of course, you can probably guess this, or anybody who knows me can probably guess it. I'm playing one of the women with the tentacles on the back of her head. Sue me. And this was before all the recent movies, right? This is when we only had the 3 movies, and
so, Twi'leks weren't quite so common.
Yeah, they weren't canonical, really, in a gaming sense. But hey, there I was, Anyway, though, we had a fairly limited time to play. And the GM, had us go through a brief encounter to begin with, and then there was a clue, and then he was kind of getting edgy because he knew time would be running out. And I just looked him in the eye and I said, "Let me guess. If we talk to this guy and that other guy he tells us to talk to, he's going to tell us about a warehouse where that guy is holed up, right?" And the GM flinched. He was like, "Well, yeah, kind of a, how'd you know the guy was going to be in a warehouse that I was going to direct you to? How could that be, right?" And I said, "Look, it's okay. I like it. It's great. Can we start with when we get to the warehouse?" And that is a way to play. Yeah. But as you can see, there's nothing very emergent about it except for the thespian aspects.
Right.
And those can be fun, but I've had my fill of thespianism being my priority at the table. And so the idea, killing, it's an agency word. It's not when do we get in a fight, it's when do I want to kill that guy.
Right. It shifts the focus completely into what have you decided to do with what you've stumbled across. And it's not for everybody, I guess we should say.
Absolutely, and that's why I want it up front that that's what I'm doing in every page of the book. Yeah. If there's one thing I can say about my games as a whole, It's that I will not try to pretend any one of those games is anything but what it is. And it's almost written deliberately to put up the big red flags and say, yes, I did just say that, and if that's not your thing, no blood, no foul, but, watch a movie.
Right.
Or something else.
Well, we do have a lot of choice now. I mean, so many years ago, 30 years ago, I wouldn't, when I started playing 30 years ago, I wouldn't see another role-playing game for 7 years.
Wow. Yeah. I came into it at that interesting time when, as I've written about a couple of times, and my larger writing about it isn't publicly available yet, in the late 70s, there were at least 3 D&Ds, hypothetically. There was Holmes' version in 77. That was the most commonly available one. But in 78, you had the Monster Manual for AD&D, but you also had the reissue of the original 1974 game in its white box. So there you were with this mess in front of you, trying to figure out how to play this game. And then there was Tunnels and Trolls, there was the Fantasy Trip, and there were RuneQuest, all in. And if you kept going, we can move up into 1980, and then things like you got Champions and Arms Law and all these things. Traveler, I forgot to mention Traveler. All these things are kicking around, and I had a very much a smorgasbord approach or a contact with role-playing at the time, and I felt when it came to the late 80s, 10 years later, I was kind of shocked that a lot of other people didn't have that. There was much more brand loyalty built into the hobby at that point, and there was also, it's pre-internet.
Yeah, really, distribution problem too, yeah.
Yeah, you really just have contact with very few. When you move into the early 90s, then the stores are doing their product lines, and, the store owner is very intent on you buying supplements as if they were periodicals. So he's trying to engender brand loyalty, right? So it was interesting to me to not. I mean, I found it interesting to talk to people my age, and I'd be excited that they would say, "Oh yeah, oh," and that's another thing. Until recently, it was very much, especially in the 90s, the idea was if the game was not in print or not available at your store when they told you it was out of print, which I now know is often a lie, you were supposed to ignore it.
Yeah. Nobody plays that game.
Yeah, exactly. And so I made an effort, I'd say just over 20 years ago, some friends and I made an effort that we were going to pull all the stuff off our shelves that we always really wanted to play anyway.
Yeah.
And the group would stay together, but we would shift from game to game as we played games like, a contemporary game at the time that somebody had just bought and really wanted to play, or in my case, I pulled out 1983 Marvel Superheroes.
Awesome
which
game.
I had never, yeah, of course, but I had never played it, and until that point of the mid-90s, nobody knew, because I discovered this on the internet along with everybody else, that everybody still loved it. It was all closeted, right? There was no knowledge. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they did it at conventions and stuff. I didn't go to a gaming convention until 2000. But still, it seemed to me as though the love or the fascination or potential enjoyment of so many games that were on all of our shelves, collectively speaking, there was no social mechanism to get those games played or discussed. And so, playing Marvel Superheroes for me at that point was just absolutely joyous.
Sure.
And I think that now, I've said it before, I mean, the millennium, 2000 on, to me, I really wanted to promote, and I think I've helped promote, the idea that we are back in the late 70s. And again, we're facing some of the same countermeasures too. The idea that D&D hovers in the firmament above us all, so what happens to it should matter to all of us. that same myth that occurred in 1979 is still occurring now. So that's an interesting thing that's the same too. But really what's great is how many things are down here in the mud with the rest of us. Never mind the firmament.
Yeah.
Which isn't really up there actually. And so you end up with this amazing set of things to do. Even just on G+, it crosses all of our streams, drafts of stuff that people are just hurling up there for fun.
Yeah.
And if one wanted to concentrate on those, you could. In my case, I'm looking forward to dusting off my 3rd edition champions. I've discovered how few people know champions before 4th edition.
Right.
And so I'm looking forward to dusting off 3rd and playing that again. Also, as a friend of Steve Long's, and now finally having seen Champions 6th edition, which is the most radical revision of the game to date, now I want to play that. So new, old, this philosophy of play, that philosophy of play. I think it's exciting. It's been exciting for 15 years.
Yeah, and without experimentation, without a little bit of exploration within what's present, how can you really know what you like or where your voice is? You can't pick up a game and run it like a pro the very first time. I mean, explore.
That brings me to an interesting point about the somewhat fuzzy boundaried OSR, because I think that's an experimental group of creators for the most part. And so, in a way, the avowed sort of conservatism of the game design really is quite illusory. There's actually a great deal of diversity in those different systems that points to many different experiences of play. And it's almost as though claiming there's a commonality is kind of a comfort zone that that you can all say, but that's not really the case in practice. You can actually have an extremely broad, extremely fun range of experiences in the games nominally in that category. I played a number of them, and I like quite a few of them. So, I'm not sure where you want to go with the question now. Is there a Circle of Hands question?
Yeah, so we're circling back to Circle of Hands. This kind of, let's say, the emergent properties that exist within the game for play. The way that you have set up character creation so that you can discover your character as you go, I found was quite efficient at producing those spark moments where you go, yes, I have a very clear vision of this part of their personality, and then you're prepared for inspiration when you hit the table. I feel. I thought that coming where it does in the text and then moving into venture preparation, it's almost like you're working in concert. The characters, the players are summoning up these elements of character that will become something, and the person who's the GM at that time is summoning up elements of situation that, once all of these things are brought together, will become something. Really encapsulates the spirit of this. It was nice to be able to read through a cogent description of not the theory of it, not the ideal of it, but to do it, one must first do this. It was a relief.
It is a little patrician. I've often been run aground in discussions in role-playing games about whether we're being descriptive or prescriptive. And in this case, I decided it's all going to be prescriptive. It's all going to be instructional. And the process, I enjoyed your presentations, especially when you got to Chapter 3 and started doing that venture prep, and all of a sudden you're kind of semi-ironic, what do you mean semi? You're totally ironic, outsider, judgmental, I'm going to look at this game and,
it would be objective.
And should it fall short of my expectations, you can bet I'm gonna give it a what for. Yeah. And then chapter 3, you sort of turned into this raving, and my guy is like this.
I know.
And I was kind of going, okay, my job here is done.
Exactly. It was a nice treat for me, I got to say.
So the hope is, of course, again, we're hitting that emergent property again and again, and you might be interested to know how the 3 levels that I do talk about in the game of backdrop and situation and scenes came about, and it all was centered around the issue of rape, which in the very first days of the Kickstarter, people read the little chapter sample that I had stuck up and the rundown, and there was a kerfuffle. There was a variety of negative comments thrown around in a variety of different directions on different parts of the internet about it, and I was talking with the women in my playtesting group at the moment, who was and she was she had just got a whole bunch of negative feedback from people she knew, and she was kind of going, that's weird, that's not in our game, that's not, what's going on? And in talking with her, I realized that when people read something that they called setting, they did not distinguish between that as a backdrop feature, which may or may not be in a situation in play, and in a situation of play may or may not even be in a scene of play. They were not distinguishing. To them, if it was mentioned, it meant that your female character was going to get threatened with it, as soon as the boots were on the ground.
This is how you play the game.
This is how you play the game, exactly. So again, it's a matter of description and prescription right there. So that's when I came up, after a little while of really working through different models, I came up with that 3-layered model to put the responsibility where it belonged when it comes to content of that sort, and also to point out that this is not, you can't be as superficial as to say, well, name something you hate, name or are afraid of or dislike or just don't want to see in a role-playing game. When you say this is in this game, what do you mean by that? What is meant by the phrase?
All day, all the time.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be in your character's lap or not. And I think that it was just that. I mean, it was, and of course, I'm in a situation of talking about this that I'm not sure I want to be in regard to all these people being upset at me or making their having reactions. And I found that it was, and yet of course wanting to write the game that I wanted to write. There's no compromise for me in that regard. So I say, all right, I'm going to try and figure out what it is that's making this so harsh. And I'm talking about people in some cases who have played extraordinarily brutal games. I mean, not tender, shrinking flowers of, decorum here. And so I really wanted to discover what it was. And so I found that in this entire game, the issue of what is the setting like, but what is play like, that I therefore had to be incredibly prescriptive in venture prep.
Right.
That you say, okay, as a GM, what on earth is going to happen here? What on earth is going to happen here that makes it, the kind of grit that we want, but also is not a boundary-threatening, person-threatening phenomenon. And we all have to take our responsibilities about that at the table. I think I'm pretty clear about that. The players and the GM are equals as far as these things are concerned. And so that, actually, now that I think about it, there's a lot of theory in there, but it depends on what you want to call theory. I mean, I have maybe the wrong mindset. I think theory is a bunch of coherent statements about reality based on what we know. That's what I call theory. And so when I talk about those veils and stuff like that, in the text, I talk about, what are lines? Lines are not things that you write down beforehand saying, I won't do that, or at least if you do, there should be very few of those. Lines are things you encounter in play. you realize there's a line here. So what do you do when you encounter a line that's optimal for Circle of Hands? So you can call it theory if you want, which to me only means makes sense.
Sure.
And then I try to put it into an instructional mode,
Right.
which I don't think can be done generically. I mean, the instructional mode for talking about lines and veils for Circle of Hands is 1,000 times different than it would be for Marvel Superheroes.
Sure.
Right. So
I guess that's
these are
mostly
different...
where we run into trouble is
Right.
there are. We talked earlier in the interview about the assumptions that the players, game master included, bring to the table, but of course this is also true for the person who writes the game. Their bias is baked in, their viewpoint is baked in, and when you point out, I don't understand section X in chapter Y, they're like, oh, why not? It's obvious, isn't it? Where Circle of Hands, I think, takes the effort, takes the time, takes the advantage of all those playtester comments, and gives you a game where you can walk through and say, I know how to play this game.
Well, or at least have as few speed bumps as possible, through the learning process. I like to think that all of my games have a steep learning curve, but it's not very tall. I don't mind my games having a steep learning curve because I don't think that I fail to design them. So they're going to be idiosyncratic. They're going to be put together in a way that's highly specific, each one being different from the others. And yet, what I want is for that curve to level off really fast and people to be way down the road before they realize it,
right.
If at all possible. And in this case, I think that's one of the things that playtesting has shown me. The only other game that I have that really fires that hard earlier than they expect. People think they're still learning. They think it's still hard. They think there's 1,000 things more to learn before we can really play. And then they suddenly realize that their character is doing things, almost before their eyes. The other game that does this of mine is Trollbabe. That's the game where your character is taking action almost before you realize that you've said it. And so I think that... oh, by the way, are you familiar with the term kicker from Sorcerer?
Yes.
I don't know if that's right. The idea that the player actually writes what just dramatically changed in the character's life as the final step in character creation. And that the GM's prep is largely composed of the various characters' kickers.
Right.
But the idea being that no, your character is whatever comfort zone your character was in as a static character sheet portrait is over.
Right. Now let's play.
Now let's play. And so I think that in Circle of Hands, I wanted to feel more of a traditional setup with there's no moment where you say, okay, now I shall write my kicker. There is more of a, as you say, it doesn't matter when the spark hits during character creation, but only that it does hit.
Only that it does.
Yeah. And so it's also tricky too. I mean, how easy is it to fall into, I've got armor, I've got a sword, I've got a horse, I've got, my comrades. How easy is it to fall into that and have that itself be a comfort zone? I paid a lot of attention to trying to get as much productive familiarity with that into place. In fact, I even wrote my first color text, sort of a fictional account of being a character in the setting in the very first chapter, right? Compared to most role-playing games, I mean, it's minuscule. It's a whole total of 6 or 7 paragraphs total,
right?
Short ones of and it's in second person. It's not in first person or third person. So it's told in the you do this, you do that, and I found that it was surprisingly gratifying to write that bit. I usually don't particularly like that kind of color fiction in my games, and I think it's only successful maybe once in every, geez, 30 or only once out of every 30 or 40 games that has it is when I really feel like it works for me. And in this particular case, I enjoyed writing it. So it was, yeah.
The sense that I get when I read through Circle of Hands is that there's a lot of enjoyment. I mean, I was expecting passion when I got into it, and having looked at the rundown and things like that. But what I find is there is a humorous enjoyment that bubbles up as you go through the text.
I can't help that kind of thing. I arguably one of the most serious things I've ever written in our hobby is called Shahida, which is Arabic for the witness, and it is a book about the Lebanese Civil War, utterly historical. And then the final chapter is game rules. I use the same model in my book about Berlin and spying as well. They're a special series of mine. And you really can't get more grim than talking about the events of the Lebanese Civil War. Well, you can. There are other things around the world that have happened that would be equally grim, but the point being is that it's right up there. And yet, something about it, and I was deeply inspired by the books I was reading that come out of the war directly. That's another aspect of that series. Same thing with the divided Germany and the divided sides of Berlin. And a lot of the literature that comes out of it, and these are people who are like writing with bombs, going off in the air above them. The wicked humor that comes out of there, the incredible, I don't know if it's a defense or if it's a manifestation of the human spirit or whatever you want to call it, but there's a quality to it that I find very, it speaks to me, I guess I would say, as a reader. And often I can be writing about something that's, you can't help but notice that, I wouldn't mind running into a spider hag one of these days. And it's kind of like, you're reading this and you're like reading the paragraph, and I've had people who know me kind of slam the book shut and look at me in an accusatory manner and say, "Ron," and it's the same. And yeah, I think that I'm never going to lose. Do you remember in the short story "The Jewels in the Forest" by Fritz Leiber? It's a Fafhrd and Mauser story.
I have not.
The one? Okay. There is what is otherwise something of a throwaway scene where we open upon our heroes being pursued on horseback by some guys who are trying to kill them. And they, with a little bit of tactics and a little bit of experience, but with a great deal of desperation, because the fights in that series are all desperate.
Right.
They manage to do in their attackers, and the bulk of the story is about something else entirely, deeper in the forest. But the main, one of the two main characters is the Mauser, he's from the fantasy equivalent of Tyre. He's very, very Lebanese, and he after killing his opponent, very clinically as well. His reaction to the guy's corpse lying there is to be kind of sickened by it. He doesn't want to look at it. Dead people lying around disgust him. He feels all emotionally all blocked up about the whole thing. And these guys are thugs. They're nameless thugs. This isn't like a dramatic moment at all, but still, we get this emotional reaction from the character. His barbarian friend, who's very Scandinavian, after having killed his opponent, has a laughing fit and just has this huge, almost existential laugh at the universe, laugh at your own self, laugh at the folly of the fact that you lived and this guy died and it could have gone the other way. Just laugh at it all. And then takes the guy he's killed, straightens his arms and legs, lays him out in a ritual fashion, cries for a couple of minutes, and then hops up to his feet and walks on like nothing's happened, while the mouser is still standing there feeling sick, looking at the corpse. And I think that in a way, that degree, I mentioned this actually in the annotations to Sorcerer in the latest version, that degree of laughter about things, I don't think I'm ever going to get it out of my writing. I think you'll find it in all of my books. Yeah,
that's good.
It's a quality. Yeah.
So I mean, it gave Circle of Hands the backdrop, the ill-focused first glimpse of my perception of the Crescent Lands. It made it more authentic that it was there, a natural reaction to it. But we're almost out of time. There was one thing that I wanted to talk about before we left, which is, I'll just share the cover of the book again. The Heartbreaker Redemption Project.
Oh yeah.
Could you explain how, for you, this is that kind of game?
Well, the word heartbreaker, as I introduced it, or I used the term in my essays of so long ago, going on 12 years now, I think. The term is genuine. It's when a game that you're holding is so personal, you can almost tell it jumps right off the table of what people were really doing in whatever house ruling of whatever system that they had, until the moment that they actually realized that they had effectively written a new game, that they really weren't using anything in that rulebook anymore. And they decided in their passion that they want to share this. And there's so many different ways that this was so painful for so many people. The printing and distribution situation of 20 years ago is, or more, is very much to blame. Effectively, as I tried to say in this book, the Heartbreaker authors that I was talking about in those essays, they didn't screw up, they got screwed over.
Right.
And whatever peccadillos or critiques I might have of their content were not sins, they were emblematic of the isolation of gamers at that time, and which sometimes still applies. But the idea here is that we all really meant it when we wrote our first few role-playing games.
Yeah.
And when I say we, I don't mean people who currently have any published. I mean we. I don't know if you've run across my frequently repeated statement that I think that good game design is best understood as a personality disorder of a player. Not all players have it.
Right.
Not all players have it, but a lot of us do. And that publishing is like the severe version of that same personality disorder.
Yeah.
And so what I'm trying to do in that statement is break down the common dichotomy of creator versus fan, which I abominate for our hobby. I think as soon as you enter into thinking in that dichotomous way about our hobby, I think that you've lost an immense, immense amount of content of what we do. And the issue here is that the Heartbreakers, to me, were precisely what our hobby, socially and economically, should have nurtured, rather than dismissed, and as I saw at the time, mocked as amateurish or mocked as, or anything of the kind. And although I'm very blunt in my essays about their shortcomings, usually due to the author's lack of familiarity with the broader range of rules and stuff for different ways to play, still, they had what I thought was missing in a lot of the larger efforts of the 90s. And I think that especially I want to re-emphasize to people that a lot of us are running around with those things in those manila folders. You know where one guy had his that he dug up after reading that?
Where?
In a you know those cardboard boxes that collared shirts come in?
Shirt box, no way.
He had his old manuscript from when he was, 18 or something. And we're talking huge, right?
Right.
Reams of paper in that shirt box where it had sat for 20 or 25 years. And I think there's a lot of that kind of thing out there. And many people I know are, they are might be embarrassed in retrospect or whatever, but it's often, I think, fruitful to say, what was I trying to do? And yeah, I can, with any luck, be sympathetically humorous about many of the things that you have in there. I mean, many of them have, for example, detailed vehicle rules. And I have yet to see, or whatever, but I have yet to see one of my friends or acquaintances dig it up and say, oh yeah, I better keep those vehicle rules, right? But they may have any number of things, but they also have the thing that made them want to put all that effort down. Instead of taking their notes in their chemistry class, there they were in the back of the class in high school, writing in their ring-bound paper, all their character classes or whatever it was in the game. And
for me, it was dice mechanics.
There you go. Yeah. There you were writing it down. And the question is, though, what was it? Can you see anything in it now that maybe you've forgotten? Maybe you could fan into a new flame. And so in many ways, this was an experiment for me. This is taking the fact that we all wrote games with a certain naivete about the way the games work, and with a great deal of creative passion that was untempered by irony, untempered by, sure, your dwarves were purple and had 4 arms. Alrighty then, And so they were original because they were purple and had 4 arms.
Well, they were still Scottish.
Of course they were. And so still you look at that and you go, well, what kind of exoticism was I shooting for? Which one of these 7 races is actually the keeper? Which is the one that I put in because I had to have it, and then the rest because I thought I was supposed to have? Which one is the keeper? You know what? I'm going to make my game about that now. That's what my game is, this race. Or, in the case of another fellow, he had this incredibly, and his was all handwritten too, God help us. Oof. And, there's more than, some of them are. And I've seen a lot of these now. And this one, he ultimately realized that what he wanted were these decadent, weary, utterly professional duelists who fought with 2 swords, who were dueling at the behest of all these useless asshole aristocrats. and
somebody had a minimum wage job.
yeah, exactly. But he, if you look at his incredibly intensive write-up, that really only accounts for maybe 20% of the material, but it's a hell of a lot more than any other character concept got.
Right.
And a great deal of the other material is just really stuff that he thought had to be in there because it's a game, or a fantasy game. But looking at it, he's going, man, I could write a game about these duelists, where they were either the central or a primary element of the characters that you could play.
Right.
I could do that, and I would go to town on my 2-sword dueling techniques. Now I have a reason to do so.
Right.
And I think that second look to, we've all become too ironic. We've all become too millennial, if you will, too mimetic, too tropey oriented.
Yes.
And to recover. You read Jeffro Johnson's blog, I remember, as I recall, and watching him go through his realizations as he reads those books, and finally realizes what he's reading, that he's not reading Appendix N. There is no Appendix N. Right. There's 1,000 books out there of that era, and this was an almost random sweep of just grabbing some titles that this particular fantasy reader happens to like. And it's not a sacred list, right? It's not the creme de la creme. There's some crap in there. And
it's a particular flavor of crap.
Yeah, it really is. There you go. And when he realized that, when Jeffro realized that, his writing about these things changed.
It did.
And he even said it flat out, I don't think I can talk about fantasy with most of my friends anymore. If they don't know this in this visceral fashion, I don't know what to tell them. I'm not even sure I want to know their opinions about anything. And it sounds so elitist in a lot of ways, but I do think there is this shift in perspective toward fantasy, toward the experience of fantasy, that it's not bounded by genre conventions, that fantastic writing by definition can kick open any door it wants to. That when Jessica Amanda Samuelson wrote her fantasy, she was kicking open a variety of doors. When Moorcock wrote his, he was kicking open his. When Howard wrote his, he was kicking open doors.
Yeah.
They weren't saying fantasy is like XYZ, why I believe I shall write some.
Yeah.
And I think that it would be nice, maybe for gamers, maybe looking, because how many of those backpack or shirt box or, old manila folder games do you think are lying around out there?
Yeah.
I have people who read my essays 12 years ago, 13 years ago about this, didn't admit it to me until last year that they had them. I had to say, you've got one, don't you? And they're like, oh, whatever. I said, no, whatever. You've got one, son of a bitch. And he's like, yeah, it's got like lizard people and stuff. And I was like, come on, let me see it. So the Heartbreaker Redemption Project at this point is very informal. It's really just at the stage of let's dig these things up.
Right.
At the very least, let's
by example.
Yeah, exactly. I am. I'm attempting to.
Right.
What about you? Do you have one of these things lying around?
Lying around? Well, I'll have to confirm that in August. I'm going home, and an old friend that I used to game with was kind enough to take all of my stuff that I left behind in my parents' basement when my parents lost their basement. So I'll be going to sift through all of my accumulated crap, all my old games, and all of my Word discs and my
oh yeah. Well, let me just put it this way: at the end of August, you can expect an email from me.
All right.
I'm going to say, I know you did one or two or three or four. The question is, did you find any?
Yeah.
So yeah, really, that's what the Heartbreaker Redemption Project is. It's a matter of discovering the joy of fantastic creation.
Awesome.
This is the goal.
All right. Well, thanks for taking your time to speak with me this morning and tonight. And I look forward to seeing what comes next from Adept Press.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate all the time you've taken and all the scheduling it took for a 17-hour time difference. And we'll see what the masses, the assembled masses, have to say next.
All right. Take care.
Take care.